Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this late spring day, this opportunity to study your word and meet you in Matthew's gospel. As we hear you described in this text, we pray that you will also be revealed to us in our daily life, that we will know you more deeply, and that we will follow you more faithfully and feel you sending us out into this world in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, friends, so here we are in our seventh and last for a little while, the last of our Meeting Jesus in Matthew studies. I want to take credit like I planned it. I just am going to tell you that it just worked out, and we can give credit to the Holy Spirit. But the series is ending right as the lectionary on Sunday morning is picking it up at the same section of Matthew's Gospel. I couldn't have planned it. So last week, we heard this past Sunday, we heard what's next from last week. And so it was like we had Thursday, and then we went right into Sunday's text, and we were ready for it. It just catapulted us into that text in Matthew's Gospel. And we continue, which is why I did know that we were studying Matthew's Gospel in the lectionary for the summer. And I wasn't really excited about that. And so that's why I wanted to study Matthew with all of you, to get more excited about Matthew's gospel and who Jesus is in Matthew. So I'm so grateful, because now I feel really engaged by the text for this coming Sunday, which is exactly what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay. So let me pull up the share screen and we'll look at our presentation, which I've been working on as we go. And now it's also, I've shared it on Facebook. So if you want to look at the whole presentation or go back over it with your Bible open and see what you can glean from it, feel free to do that. It's in there in its entirety, and there's no more empty pages at the end, because I decided this version would be finished. So Meeting Jesus in Matthew, I'm going to close your eyes if this makes you dizzy. I'll tell you when we get there. We've done a lot of things. We've looked at geography. We've talked about how Jewish the text is. Those sandals tell me I'm there. Here we go. And last week, we've seen, how Jesus arrived in Matthew's gospel, and then how Jesus functioned to call people to follow him as disciples. And then he did this big teaching on a mountain, the Sermon on the Mount, with lots of lessons in it. And then he started to heal people and perform miracles. And it was shown that his authority started to really expand all the way to the seas and the winds. As people were afraid of dying in a boat, he was napping, and he woke up and he calmed the sea. And so we left, I believe, last week understanding that Jesus not only had authority over leprosy and demons and death and illness. He raised somebody from the dead. He raised a girl from the dead. He also had authority over the elements of creation, right? The modern day explanation of that. Hi, Aunt Betty, I see you there. Hello. The modern day, when you think about elements in creation and power, think about Frozen, right? You've got Elsa, who can make these fractal ice things, and that's a very scary thing in the story of Frozen, because she has so much power over creation, it scares the heck out of people. Jesus, although we think it's pretty cool he could calm the wind and the seas, it might have also been a little frightening to his disciples that he could command the elements of creation, right? So I just say that so that we don't think it's all fun and magical games. It's actually such a deep power, it's frightening. So as I was getting ready for today, what I read about the Gospel of Matthew that makes it stand out from other Gospels is it has more miracle stories than the other Gospel texts. There are over 20 miracles, distinct miracles. There are about 20 distinctive miracles. And then there are several verses, maybe 8 to 10, that say, oh, and he healed all these people and cast out all these demons, sort of like glossing over many, many more miracles. So in Matthew's gospel, the Jesus that we meet is a Jesus who performs miracles left, right, and center. Everywhere he goes, he's performing miracles, okay? which is different. I mean, I think of Luke's gospel as having a lot of healing stories and relational stories, and John's gospel has some powerful signs and miracles as well. This is like one after the other. It's sort of a snowball of miracles in Matthew's gospel, okay? So this is where we are today in our order of Matthew's gospel. We get to Matthew 9:27, verse 31, which I'm going to read to you. And then we'll look at some other stories. In Matthew 9:27, which is our next text, we see, somebody's waving at me from the window. That was not Lulu, it was Dave. So Matthew 9, verse 27, let me switch back to that section. We have Jesus giving sight to the blind, which I don't think we've had yet in Matthew's gospel, have we? We've had leprosy. Yep, we've had leprosy, we've had demons, we've had the girl who died, we had the mother-in-law with a fever, we had the woman with the 12-year issue of blood, but we haven't had blindness. So one of the reasons Matthew might be doing this is to show how complete Jesus's authority is over all kinds of ailments. That, you know, it's hard, people are going to be hard pressed to think that there's anything Jesus can't do. There's anything this healer can't figure out how to heal. So this is a very short healing story. There's two short healing stories in a row if you want to listen. One is the sight to the blind, and the other is the speechless, demonized man, which is going to bring us into last week's Sunday's lesson. So starting at verse 27 of chapter 9, Jesus went on from there. 2 blind men followed him, crying loudly, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he entered the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I'm able to do this?" They came to him and asked him, they said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their eyes were opened. Then Jesus sternly ordered them, see, the first word is see that no one knows of this. But they went away and spread the news about him throughout the district. So what we have going on here is 2, not 1, but 2 blind people come to Jesus, and he says to them, "Do you think I can do this?" And they say, "Yes." And he says, "According to how much faith you have, be healed by that faith." And their eyes are opened. And then I think it's very ironic that he sternly orders them see, using the same thing that he just gave them, sight, that no one knows of this. And of course, what do? They go around and blab to everyone. Okay, so that's how word of his authority starts to really spread. Okay, why do you think he might sternly order them not to tell anyone? Any ideas? And maybe somebody who doesn't have a ready answer from a scholarly commentary like I do. I've got one right here. But what about some other folks that are maybe hearing that sort of information for the first time? Why would Jesus say to someone, "Don't tell"?
Maybe he's
using on the Sabbath
psychology.
One more time, Susan.
Maybe he's using reverse psychology.
That's right. Maybe he's saying this is a secret, and then everybody says, "Oh, I want to know a secret." Maybe. Jan, what were you going to say?
I was wondering if this was a Sabbath day.
Ooh, maybe he was doing something he didn't want to have to face the leaders about, right? Yeah. Any other ideas?
I've heard him say, I don't know whether it's in Matthew, but it's not his time yet. I don't know. That's why.
Yep. So, and why do you think they disobey him? Why wouldn't they obey him if they believe he can heal him? So maybe it's not his time. Maybe he's healing on the Sabbath or doesn't want to deal with the authorities, or he kind of wants them to tell. But why do they disobey him?
I would be so excited to get my sight back. I want everybody to know.
How could you not say something? Someone's got to realize that you can see.
And people would notice, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
If these blind people were sighted them. They'd have to explain what happened.
That's right. How they got to see again. It'd be very hard not to tell the story and just say, I can't tell you if your whole life, right? So I want to read you what the commentary says about this, because I think there's a uniquely Jewish perspective about obedience that is somehow at play here in a way that I don't grasp very easily. And let's see if this helps. This element in the story functions at the level of Matthean theology, the theology of Matthew's gospel, not literal history. Matthew wants to illustrate a theological point, namely obedience to Jesus's commands, except that it's disobedience, right? Matthew looks through his sources to find an instance where Jesus's command is disobeyed. In Mark, you've got the motif of the messianic secret, which Matthew doesn't really do a lot around. And Matthew had omitted these words in their original setting in chapter 1, but now finds how to reincorporate this. So the essence of discipleship is not miraculous wonders, but obedience to Jesus's word. So I'm not sure I fully grasp the meaning of that, but what I think what they're saying, Matthew wants to express that it's not because Jesus healed you that you are a disciple, but that you obey him. So that you could experience the healing of your eyes and still disobey Jesus's commands means that it's complicated or really hard to be a disciple, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which leads us into the next text where Jesus is sending people out 2 by 2. He's taking apostles and turning them into, he's taking disciples and turning them into apostles and sending them out. And so this idea, like, I can heal you, but that doesn't mean it's easy peasy from here on. I'm going to ask you to do something hard, and they fail to do it, right? It's kind of an interesting piece for people who are very focused on obedience to law and to the law of God. But maybe they don't understand Jesus as being God. They know he's a healer, but they don't understand that what he asks them to do has a divine piece to it, right? So the next healing story, any comments about that before I move us into the speechless demonized man story in verse 32? Okay, so verse 32, this is a very short story. It's really just 2 or 3 verses, 3 verses. So after they had gone away, that means these blind, the healed, no longer blind men, a demoniac who was mute was brought to him. Now, so you just had 2 men who were blind, and now you have 1 man with 2 ailments. Okay, these kind of sit together like little similar pairings. A demoniac who was mute was brought to him. And when the demon had been cast out, presumably by Jesus, the one who had been mute spoke. And the crowds were amazed and said, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "By the ruler of the demons, he casts out the demons." Okay. So 2 blind guys go and tell everybody. It maybe gets some of the leadership antsy and anxious. And then a demoniac who can't speak comes before him. Jesus casts out the demon. The man can speak. They rave, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." However, the leaders, the Pharisees, say he did it because he's working for the demon side. That's how he has control of the demons. It suddenly takes a turn, the story, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. You don't hear the Pharisees say, "Well, thank goodness you healed that man. We didn't know how to do it. We're so glad." They're not expressing gratitude. They're not even, they might be in awe, but I think they're feeling pretty threatened because he's growing in popularity. The 2 blind guys have traveled all over. It said, they were told not to tell anyone, but they spread the news about him throughout the district, all around the Sea of Galilee, we presume. So the word is spreading. These Pharisees are getting anxious. Okay.
It almost sounds like the Pharisees are responding to the acclamations of the crowd saying, "Never has anything like this been seen in Israel." It's like, oh, we better put a lid on that.
Totally. And so to put a lid on it, they use the very thing that he's cast out that scares the heck out of everybody, demons, right? They use the very thing that Jesus can cast out to create, like to cast aspersions, right? To create the possibility that he is evil rather than healing, okay? Although he has not asked for anybody's money, he hasn't asked to be made a king. His authority is growing, and I think maybe the Pharisees expect some of that kind of thing to follow. So they want to discredit him, sort of like a dirty ad campaign, right? In a political situation where you say, well, did he or didn't he do the thing? You know, they're casting aspersions so that people aren't quite so hyped up on Jesus. Okay, what I love about this story, and I mentioned this in the sermon on Sunday, the next verse does not say, and Jesus chewed them out, or Jesus told them what jerks they are, or Jesus stood up on something and railed against the Pharisees. The very next verse says, then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. It's one of those umbrella catch-alls of all, like more miracles happened in all these different villages and cities and synagogues, and he's proclaiming the good news of this new kingdom. So Jesus's response to the Pharisees' accusation is nothing verbal and everything action oriented around healing, which I love. I think that's really useful for me. To think that when people accuse us or cast aspersions, instead of getting defensive, I would prefer that I would be more like Jesus in that verse, going about the work that I'm called to do and not bothering to feel like I have to defend myself. Wouldn't y'all like to be like that? Maybe you all are like that.
From 800 service.
You know, it would be nice. Jesus doesn't take the bait.
800 service.
Jesus does not take the bait if they were baiting him. Maybe they were talking to somebody else and he didn't hear it. And the way Matthew put it together makes it look like that. So at some level, maybe Jesus doesn't know. But the bottom line is he keeps going about his ministry, curing. And this is an interesting word in the Greek, every, like all of the disease and all of the sickness. Okay. So there's not any disease or sickness that's outside of Jesus's healing power. We've got blindness, we've got leprosy, we've heard the whole list, the demon, the mute, and Jesus goes around doing more of that. So that's the pivot that's in the middle of our screen here. This is the big pivot moment. We've got miracle after miracle, building up a sense of Jesus's authority. And then it's time for him to turn and to invite his followers to now go out and do what he's doing, to enlarge the mission, okay? So that was our text from Sunday in church. Jesus authorizes these disciples, which are followers, and turns them into apostles, which makes them sent out, like missionaries, okay? Apostolos is sent out, and so they are being sent out like missionaries. And then the next big text in Matthew's gospel, the way Matthew's organized this, is to give a whole lot of verses, like a chapter of Matthew, preparing them. It's a bit of a teaching, sort of like, Betsy, you've helped do this when we've gone to Appalachia and Honduras in the past. Hannah and I, and you've helped to organize a training for all the people that we send out from St. Andrews so that they can learn how to have safe church practices around children, how we have to maintain the paperwork, what to do in an emergency. We train everybody before we send them out to Honduras and Appalachia, right? So that's what Jesus does in chapter 10 of Matthew. He's giving them all the training and teaching before they get out there and do it. And it's tough. This missionary discourse is a really tough section of Matthew's gospel. It's really retro injecting information from a post-Easter scenario. So it's not like Matthew's writing this in the moment, but rather Matthew is thinking about the people in, say, Antioch, Syria, the community he's writing this for, and he's understanding all the things that have happened, and he's going back and sharing this And this discourse helps explain a lot of the bad things that have happened to Christians, the followers that were sent out, right? The folks in Antioch would understand that to follow Jesus and be sent out as a missionary meant a hard life. And this text in Matthew's gospel is going to explain that a little bit, or say that you should expect that. So let's take a look at the Missionary Discourse, how Jesus is giving away the authority to others, or sharing his authority, that there will be some unexpected outcomes, that there will be courage required, there will be a cost to the missionary, and but in the end, the real joy will come in sharing the hospitality that Jesus shared with them with other people. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Any questions before I move us into that? All right, this may feel familiar for some of you from Sunday. Would somebody like to read this aloud? It's got some really fun names.
I'll read it if you want me to, Dina.
Oh, please do, Robert.
Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him.
So here we see that little info retro injected, the one who betrayed him, right? In the moment, if he was taking notes in the moment and writing it, we wouldn't know that. If it was Dear Diary, he wouldn't know that yet about Judas Iscariot. So he's explaining that after the fact. In Matthew's gospel, it's not very important who these men are and what their names are, except for maybe the first couple of them. I meant to break it right here into a list so you could see that they're sent in pairs of 2. 6 pairs of 2. What's really important is that there's 12 of them, and that represents, when we talked about eschatology earlier, the things that are about the end times or how the story will end, there's this sense that the story can only end if all 12 tribes of Israel are gathered back together. That would be a real sense of completion and fulfillment in Matthew's gospel. So Matthew, who's concerned with fulfillment and the end days and end times, is sending 12 men out 2 by 2 according to Jesus's sending, right? You'll notice in other gospels, the list of 12 doesn't match this list of 12. So you'll say, well, wait a minute, how come we have Matthew in this one? Could that be Levi in another gospel? What many people would say is it's not that important. What's important is that there were 12. And some of them are the same in all the gospels. So we just don't know why they're different. People might have thought that it was different. The original 12 were different people, right? I also really love this part. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples, so they were out doing stuff already. He brings them together, gives them authority over unclean spirits. I don't know how. You know, I imagine like a king kind of knights people with the sword. In some fashion, Jesus is giving them authority. I don't know if he speaks it or what happens, over unclean spirits to cast them out, to cure every disease and every sickness. Okay, that's a lot of power, isn't it?
Yes.
So these are the guys that go out there and do this, which, here's a question for you, my friends. Judas Iscariot, the one who we read here betrayed Jesus, do you think he cast out unclean spirits, cured diseases and sicknesses?
He did.
Yes.
Sure he did. There's a trajectory in his life, in his relationship with Jesus.
Yep.
At this point in the story, he's right in the heart of the 12.
You bet. You bet. I mean, there is somebody that, for all the things that have been said about Judas Iscariot, there are those whose lives he saved, who would have very fond feelings about this man, Judas Iscariot, right? So I just think that's something to mention, that we have no reason to think that he sent them to do this. And the way Matthew writes it, it seems like they did it, right? So I've got sandals here representing, not that I'm here in Maine at the beach, but that they go out there with their sandals on, and there's a phrase in there about shaking the dust off their sandals if people don't receive them well. This section in chapter 10 is filled with all kinds of imagery. And so we can think that Matthew took resources that were available to him and created this set of training or speeches about what it means to be sent out. And he pulled it all together instead of sprinkling it through the gospel. He really put it together in a chunk. So we have phrases like, I'm sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. And what I want to read these and ask you if you would be sent out, okay? If you would say yes to this mission. I'm sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. I want you to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Brother will betray brother. You will be hated by all because of my name. When they persecute you in one town, and oh, they will, just flee to the next town. Does this sound really like a job description you want?
No.
So for me, it says that Matthew is helping us understand that they were sent out with some knowledge that they would struggle, that the mission would be hard, and that the outcomes were to be quite unexpected. And they still did it, which is a real mark of faithfulness.
Yes.
Much of our emphasis is on Jesus and people who had faith to come to Jesus, like the two blind men, to be healed. But here, I think what's really interesting to emphasize is that those 6 pairs of men said yes to this and went out and did it. And perhaps Matthew has heard stories of how it went and has also retro-injected that in and said, man, it was hard on them. They did get rejected. They had to flee for persecution reasons, right? So that will have some traction because they will have known more about how those stories panned out than we do, okay? So it's a reminder to the church in Antioch, for example, how hard it is to be sent out by God to do God's work. Any thoughts about that? Because the speech goes on, Jesus continues to prepare them. He does kind of make reference. Here is where he follows on to what they said to him. The Pharisees said, well, it must be a demon that he does these things by. In this part of Matthew 10, he says, listen, apostles that I'm sending out, if they called me demonic, how much worse will they malign you? Right? That is a really great question. If they call him Beelzebub or that he has power from demons, how much worse will they treat the ones that he sends out, that choose to follow him, right? And that's going to be a question that's in a very different context when Matthew's community in Antioch know that they killed Jesus. So if they called me a demonic person and they crucified me, how much worse will they treat you for following me or being sent out by me? It's a very real question for people, isn't it? And then Jesus tells them, what was that?
I just said yes, really. It really
Okay.
would.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I want to make sure we didn't miss anything. I don't know if you can hear the church bells here. Can you hear them?
Mhm.
Oh.
They're at 11:45 and 5:45 every day. So lunch and, well, they say lunch and cocktail hour. So the next thing that Jesus says to them is, and this is our text for this coming Sunday, be fearless, don't be afraid. All the secret knowledge is going to be out in the open at some point. All the things that are covered up will be uncovered. And that was supposed to be a comfort to these apostles being sent out, because the truth that they knew in secret would be revealed to all at some point.
Mhm.
So they would be justified, or their names would be redeemed, if you will, at some point. The other piece is that God values you. And here, Matthew refers to sparrows, and that basically says you're worth more than at least 2 sparrows to God, which I don't find really as, I'd like to be worth a lot more than 2 sparrows, but maybe that tells us how important sparrows are, so to God, right? But this text communicates that God really deeply cares for these men that Jesus is sending out, which is really an important piece for them to hear. And then basically says, stand up for me and I'm going to stand up for you. You know, you go out there in my name and I will. It's basically kind of a courthouse reference. If you go to the stand to witness for me, I will witness on your behalf when you go to the stand, right? So that's really calling his apostles or sending them out, asking them to be courageous. And the reasons why, because God values you, everything's going to be revealed, and I'm going to stand up for you. And then the last, is it the last or second? Second to the last part of this, I've divided up into kind of subsections, is giving us the image of military service and saying, you know, just like serving in the military, this is going to cost you something. It's going to be costly and you're going to risk a lot. When everybody knows when they sign into the military, even if they sign on to the Army band, there's a chance they could be sent out into war, into a battle, right? And so this is a little bit what's happening here. Jesus is saying, I'm not bringing the kind of peace and calm everybody wants, you know, status quo. I'm bringing a sword. I'm ushering in a new age, like a military battle will announce a new regime. Okay, not necessarily one that's going to kill, but one that's going to announce a new regime is in town and has taken over, has won a victory. And then we get this really hard text about loyalty to Jesus taking priority over our relationships with our family members, even over life itself. So that's the costly part.
Hmm.
Okay. This is hard for us to read because we think, well, you know, my family's Christian. And, you know, they asked me when I was going through discernment process, a favorite question, which I think is so silly, is, Dina, would you still become a priest if your husband Dave told you not to or said, I don't want you to? It was really an interesting question. Who are you going to follow, God or your husband? Like they were trying to kind of push this point. And my thought was always, well, it's not like if my husband said, I don't think being a priest is really good for our family, that's worth discussing. But it's not the same thing as don't be loyal to Jesus, is it? Not becoming a priest isn't the same thing as not being loyal to Jesus. It's a type of vocation within that. So I just thought that was a silly question. But loyalty to Jesus in the ancient world, taking priority over family is absurd to most ancient listeners, because without your family, you're dead. Like you are literally dead. If you disconnect from your family to become a Christian, thank God the Christians welcomed you and fed you, because your family, you're like persona non grata now in your family of origin. And to leave the family to become another thing, you're done. It's like you're dead to them. They will not financially support you. You'll be without resources entirely, very much on your own. And so I can't help but think that the people in Antioch, many of them were comforted by these words because they had lost those connections with their family and were feeling affirmed that by this text that Matthew has prepared for them about how costly it is to follow Jesus, because they had already lost their families over it, right?
That is true today in a Muslim country also. You will not, if they find out in college that you get kicked out of college, in high school, you get very mocked. It's really difficult for a Muslim living at home. If you have a job, you will probably lose your job.
Exactly.
Oh.
So, and in the ancient world, you would not have a job without your parents making a connection to you for that job or work. All of your business contacts would have to do with the patronage system and who your family was loyal to. And so Jesus is replacing that patronage system with him as the only one who is your patron from now on, right? That God is your patron and no one else. So it's this otherworldly kingdom. And we know that the church grew and spread. So people signed on to this, which I find really inspiring. Here's the real kicker of this patronage relationship with Jesus. When we offer the welcome of Christ to another human being, we are being Christ to that person and welcoming Christ to be with us in that person. And it's sort of like if I send my child to an old friend who they've never met and said, go into that city that's new to you, go knock on such and such door. Let's pretend like we don't have internet anymore. Go knock on that door. And this kind of stuff that like people do and have done. And let so-and-so know that you're Dina's daughter or you're Dina's son, and they'll help you out, right? So I would expect that of my college sorority sisters or something, that if one of my kids needed something and was in town, my sorority sisters would, help parent them, right? So, and if they didn't, I would be offended because I would do that for their kids, right? That's what real friendship is about, deep friendship and those kinds of connections. And so it's very much like that here. If somebody welcomes, it's like they're welcoming, right? And when I get to welcome and take care of their child and feed their child, it's like I'm doing what I would do for them. And we understand that sort of in our own connected lives. This is how Jesus is saying to his people he's sending out, when a community welcomes you into their midst, they're welcoming Christ himself through you, okay? Which is huge. If you go on a mission trip to Kentucky and you are welcomed into somebody's home and they want to make you breakfast and biscuits and gravy, there is a moment where, as somebody who's coming from one church to another church community, we can pause and perhaps understand that they are treating me as they would treat Christ and welcoming Christ through me. And I have the great privilege of my body being the stand-in for the body of Christ in that moment. And this is sort of the big payoff of being sent out, is that there will be these moments where the body of Christ, and this is before he's died and before there's Holy Communion, but the idea of the ones he's sending out being welcomed are carrying his presence and his hospitality out there, and you get to do that. That's the payoff, right? You get to be a part of that, which is really beautiful. And so then there are also some verses at the end of that say, kind of beware of the false prophets, because, the people that are trying to enrich themselves, because there must have been some discussion in Antioch that some people were false and some people were real. And so they were remembering some teachings. Matthew was giving them some teachings from Jesus from this moment, or this kind of moment, where Jesus is saying, be careful to listen for people who are teaching in the right way. So who are the real, and that's part of the church's constant work, is to decide who are really the apostolic successors, who's really carrying on the being sent out missionary work of Christ, right? And we still figure that out. We still try to figure that out today. All right, so let me tell you what's next in Matthew, even though we're not meeting next week, contrary to what Facebook says. I don't know what I'm doing next Thursday afternoon, but we can pick this up later, especially since I think every week is going to track with the sermon. Maybe it would be good if we did this. But the texts now on Sundays are picking up where we are. So we're right where we want to kind of hand it off to Sunday sermons, if you will. But what's next in Matthew? Well, there's a lot. We've gotten to about chapter 11, and the Gospel of Matthew goes all the way to chapter 28. And so between now and chapter 28, there's going to be more conversation about who Jesus is and what he's here to do with this kingdom. And is he John the Baptist, or is he not John the Baptist? Is he something separate? That's all a battle for identity and understanding of who he is and his role. That's the next couple of chapters. Then after chapter 12, the whole rest of Matthew's gospel is the conflict that we've seen a sneak peek of, with the Pharisees accusing him of being demon possessed. The conflict is going to really ratchet up, and we get to the crucifixion, the resurrection, and then it ends, which is really interesting, with being sent out again. So it has this incredibly apostolic, sending people out into the world emphasis that I'm really appreciating in Matthew's gospel. It feels different to me than the other gospels. We just spent some time on how the disciples were transformed into being sent out missionary apostles. And that's exactly how Matthew's gospel ends, with sending them out. And in that sending them out, it's to baptize and to teach as well. So it's a fuller commissioning of the apostles, if you will. So that's the Great Commission ending of Matthew. We just had sort of a middle commissioning in Matthew's gospel, like kind of a first commissioning. And then there'll be the Great Commissioning at the end. All right.
It's sort of like a dry run.
It is a little bit. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. And I'm still around if you have some questions. You know, you've got your mentor here, right? You've got Jesus still with you in chapters 10 and 11, whereas in 28, he's giving them the Great Commission to continue without his bodily presence.
Right.
Okay. So if you want to use this presentation and go back and reread it and feel the arc, I think that feels really nice, quite frankly, because now all of these stories sit together in a particular way in your mind and heart. And when you read through them, you'll be able to kind of maybe notice some new things about the flow. And if you want to read on and continue to the end of Matthew's gospel, that helps you know what to expect next. All right. So what do you think of Matthew's gospel? Do you like it? What do you like about it, if anything?
I like that it's very direct.
Mm-hmm. It is direct.
And he's like real. He's a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very grounded in the Hebrew scriptures. I feel the relationship that the early Jewish Christians must have had with that body of sacred writing.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that I'm not sure is very Jewish, and I keep thinking about this and trying to come up with stories, so maybe you all can help me. This idea of sending these people out 2 by 2. I'm trying to think of other, the Exodus, they all go together, and it's very clear that God's in charge. But this idea of bringing people in, and it seems to me that the Judaism in the Hebrew scriptures is something you decide to do or you don't. Now Jesus is training like a sales force to get out there and go door to door, which feels, I'm just noticing that doesn't feel like it has the continuity with Hebrew scripture, although certainly there were prophets in the Hebrew scriptures that did some healings and called God's people to live differently. So I'm not sure if that's the connection, if he's calling them to be prophets in a way, or sending them out to be prophets.
But he's telling them to leave all their families. He's giving them some community to go out together. They're not going out individually. They can support one another. They have no other support system. So he's caring for them in a way by
Yep.
that.
Like creating a new kinship family.
Yeah.
Real good point.
I thought about 2 by 2, there's when some of you studied with Hannah Jethro, helping Moses get organized and judge cases. There's different models for organizing in the ancient scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures. And then there's that time where Medad and Eldad are doing stuff off to the side. But the idea of going 2 by 2, the only thing I can think of is the ark, the animals going into the ark. I can't, 2 by 2, it's such an interesting, so I was looking for some Jewish connections in the sending out. And I guess the other one I thought of was when Joshua and somebody else go into Jericho to kind of scout it out, to scout out the promised land.
Adam and Eve were together.
True. And they also disobeyed, right?
Yeah.
Like the two blind guys
Yeah.
that can see. I'm sorry, the two seeing gentlemen who were formerly blind. So it's just kind of fun to ponder, like how much of this text is very rich with that Jewish context, and how some of it kind of goes in a different direction and is leaning already into a Christian identity, I think.
Yeah. I see it as Jesus showing them the relationship aspect of belief. In other words, our relationship is with him. I see this also as a teaching for discipleship is for everyone. That's our job, and to introduce people to Jesus. And he generally, it is a relationship thing where there are two or more people that go together. I've seen that on the field. I've seen that in scripture. Relationship is a new, I guess it's a new thing with Jesus. There wasn't that much relationship in the Old Testament, as you were saying, but there certainly is in the New Testament.
It's this idea of a collaborative relationship is the vehicle for expressing or doing the evangelism work. I want to share something that some of us heard in a workshop on Thursday by Carrie Broadbent. She says she didn't invent this saying, but that's who I'm going to attribute it to, because Carrie Broadbent Schofield is who said it to us. She said that evangelism is really one hungry person telling another hungry person where to find food, how to be fed. And that's so basic. So I guess one of the questions I am looking back now at Matthew and thinking about is, they certainly know what the food is. They've been with Jesus. They've watched people be healed. So it's not like if you're hungry and I know where to eat in this town, I could just say to you, just go over there, there's some food. Or I could say, oh my gosh, they've got lobster rolls, they got garlicky fries, they got Giffords ice cream. Like, the more I can tell you about the food, the more excited you will be about going over there and eating. And these disciples who've been with Jesus can really describe the food that everybody's hungry for.
Right.
And for
I
me,
just up on Google,
Yep.
and Google was saying that in the Jewish tradition, you need 2 for witnesses.
yes, that's a good connection.
Oh,
Sure, you
So,
can't accuse somebody without 2 witnesses in a
Right.
court. Yeah. So these 2 are being sent out as witnesses to the identity of Jesus and what Jesus is doing. That's really helpful. So then it becomes Jewish all of a sudden. Well done. There's the continuity. I was looking for that continuity with Judaism. Thank you, Betsy.
sure. No, you can thank Google.
Thank you, Betsy's Google machine. So the sort of the spiritual work for me, I think, is to decide how I can, or to be so excited about the feast I'm experiencing in Jesus that I can entice somebody else to try it. And to do that, I have to think about the food and what I liked. And, why would I tell somebody who's hungry for spiritual growth and connection to God, what would I tell them about being a person of faith that's more than, oh, I really like the people at St. Andrews? It's got to be more than that. That's great. But deeper than that is when I'm all alone and I feel like I've hit the floor, there's this sense that I'm surrounded by a protection and a well-being that's outside of myself and covers me like a warm blanket. And I think that's God. So we have to start to get articulate about the feast that we experience so that somebody else who's hungry can have access to that same food, right?
Mhm.
Or
And-
tell us about the food that they're enjoying, whatever that is in God.
And it seems like as Jesus was calling the different disciples, they had a hunger because they never said why. They never said, well, those that didn't continue to follow because they had to bury their father, or I have to do this. But these men came. They knew he knew where the food was. I like that.
It's also really possible, because there's 6 pairs of 2, it's very possible that there were many, many, many more sent out. And there really was a Levi and a Bartholomew and some of the names we have in the other Gospels. But only 12 are listed because that's such a complete sense of it all. But it could have been a lot of people that went out and healed. And just imagine how different so many lives were.
Right.
I think in Luke, it is actually numbered at 70.
70, yeah, sending of the 70. And they come back in Luke. They come back
about
as
the
well.
women.
What's that?
I wonder about the women, you know, none of the women are mentioned. And
Well, that would be an interesting, so when Betsy does a further Google dissertation, we can all look at, I'm not sure in the ancient Hebrew scriptures if 2 women can be witnesses.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting to look up, you know? Could women be witnesses? Because I'm thinking about Ruth needed a man to speak for her to get the family land back. She couldn't go and make that case on her own without a male representative, right?
That's right. Mhm.
Which honestly, up until like what, the 50s or 60s, a woman couldn't buy a house on her own or something. She had her
Right.
father or
I think later than
uncle or
that.
much later than that. Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine was over 70 in the 70s or close to 79. I could not get a credit card in my own name after I was divorced.
So there we are. There we are. So the idea of women going out would be really different in Jesus's day. Although, of course, we know that, women were very involved in the Jesus mission.
Right.
We're
Right.
not really hearing it. We're not hearing too much about that.
Not yet.
Yeah. Not yet.
Although in the great groups that were sitting at his feet and listening, I do feel there were many, many women there.
Sure.
Sure.
But culturally, it is the men who do this type.
Right. And what we know about the early church is when a man would convert to Christianity, his whole household would be baptized, right?
Mhm.
And we do also know that Constantine the emperor, his mother was a Christian, but that doesn't mean he was, because she was a mother, not a father. So, it's an ancient world with an ancient way of being. Well, how was it let me get out of here and see your faces as we wrap up. Do you feel like you know Matthew, at least the first 10-ish chapters, better than you did?
Oh, yeah.
For
Definitely.
sure.
Yeah? Good.
Definitely.
I feel like I'm able to track it as a continuous story a little bit better than the hodgepodge way we do it in the lectionary. So I'm grateful for that. And I think I still want to hang out with the Jesus that's in Luke a little bit more. And yet there are parts of Jesus in Matthew's gospel I'm really appreciating, so. Any last thoughts before we sign off tonight?
No, I think this has been great, Gina. Thank you.
Mention
Yeah.
the lobster roll.
Thank you.
That's not nice.
You want to see something?
Oh, not.
Hang on. I'm going to